Dr. Evans didn't gasp. He didn't slam his clipboard down or hit the intercom for a nurse. He just stopped. He read the lab results in his hand one more time. Then he looked up at Arthur Vance, and he said nothing for what felt like 4 full seconds. 4 seconds is a long time when a child is dead asleep in your lap. 4 seconds is an absolute eternity when that child is your granddaughter. Mr. Vance, the doctor's voice came out carefully, measured, the exact tone a person uses when they aren't sure how the man across from them is going to react. How long has she been drinking this juice? Arthur did not scream. The walls of the examination room did not shake. He simply shifted his weight on the sterile plastic chair, adjusting his grip so Lily would not slide. Her head rested heavily against his collarbone. Her breathing was terribly shallow, barely a whisper against his neck. He looked at her pale cheek, tracing the faint blue veins beneath her translucent skin with his gaze. Then he looked back at the doctor. The rage inside Arthur did not burn. It froze. It was the cold, terrifying clarity of a man who spent 40 years calculating the exact moment a steel beam would snap under pressure. He knew that anger was a useless vibration. It shook the hands, it clouded the vision, it caused fatal errors in judgment. He needed total stillness. "I do not know," Arthur said. His voice was flat, devoid of the tremor the doctor was clearly waiting for. But long enough that she thought the bitter taste was normal. Long enough that my son stopped noticing. Dr. Evans set the paper on his desk, flattening the edges with his thumbs. He looked pale, almost sickened by the ink on the page. He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver a blow that would shatter an ordinary grandfather. The lab found remarkably high levels of a benzodiazepine derivative. It is a class of heavy sedatives, typically prescribed for severe anxiety, panic disorders, or severe insomnia in adult patients. In a 7-year-old child, this dosage does not just induce sleep. It systematically suppresses the central nervous system. It creates a chronic lethargic state, profound muscle weakness, mental confusion, and eventually, if continued over a prolonged period, it can lead to permanent neurological damage or respiratory failure. Someone is keeping her chemically subdued. Someone is intentionally poisoning her. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and toxic. Arthur processed the information the way he would read a catastrophic psych report. Benzodiazepine. A heavy sedative. A chemical straitjacket fitted for a little girl who liked to draw animals and run in the backyard. He thought of Eleanor, his son's wife, with her immaculate designer clothes, her perfectly curated gallery opening smiles, and her pristine social media profile. He thought of the sprawling, modern house in Bellevue where not a single cushion was ever out of place, where children's toys were never allowed to clutter the living room floor. Now he understood exactly how she kept it that way. She was treating his granddaughter like a nuisance to be silenced, a messy variable to be deleted from her flawless equation. "Are you required to call the authorities?" Arthur asked, his tone so steady, so utterly conversational that it made the doctor blink in shock. "Mr. Vance, this is active, deliberate child abuse." Evans leaned forward, his professional composure cracking, his voice rising in volume. "I am legally obligated to contact Child Protective Services immediately. The police will need to go to that house today. They need to secure the premises and interrogate the parents." Arthur gently brushed a stray lock of dark hair away from Lily's forehead. Her skin was clammy, unnatural. "If you call them right now, doctor, what happens?" "They send a squad car. They knock on the door. My daughter-in-law is a wealthy, highly connected woman. She will panic, but she will not break. She is too smart for that. She will flush whatever pills she has down the toilet before the officers even cross the threshold. She will hire a high-priced lawyer who will claim the child got into a medicine cabinet by accident. Or worse, She will twist the narrative. She will blame my son, who is currently thousands of miles away on a business trip. Dr. Evans opened his mouth to protest, to cite the law, but Arthur raised one calloused hand. It was the hand of a man who built bridges, a hand that commanded absolute silence without raising a fist. When a foundation is rotting, Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, resonant rumble in the quiet room, you do not just hit it with a sledgehammer. You assess the load-bearing walls. You find the weak points. You map the structural integrity. If you strike blindly, the whole structure collapses on the innocent people trapped inside. Right now, Lily is out of that house. She is with me. She is safe. She will not drink another drop of that poison. But my son is still standing in a burning building, completely blind to the smoke. He loves his wife. If the police show up with no hard proof, he will defend her. Evans stared at him, the rigid legal protocols fighting against the sheer, undeniable logic burning in the older man's eyes. Give me 48 hours, Arthur said. It was not a plea. It was a calculated proposal. 48 hours. Do not file the report yet. Let me secure the perimeter. Let me gather the blueprints of what this woman has done. I will find the purchase records. I will find the source. If I fail, or if I do not call you by this exact time on Thursday, you make your report. You send the police. But if you do it today, you give a predator the chance to hide her teeth. The silence returned to the small room, broken only by the steady hum of the air conditioning unit and the faint, drug-induced wheeze of the little girl. Dr. Evans looked at the damning lab results, then at the deeply sleeping child, and finally at the unwavering, flinty eyes of the grandfather. He saw no hysteria there. He saw a man who had already started drafting a meticulous demolition plan. He saw a man who was preparing for war. Evans slowly, reluctantly, pulled his hand away from the desk telephone. Thursday afternoon, the doctor said, his voice tight, compromising his entire career for the absolute certainty in Arthur's gaze. At 3 o'clock sharp. If I do not hear your voice, Arthur, I am sending the state authorities to that house, and I will be forced to tell them you obstructed my initial report. You will hear from me, Arthur replied softly. He carefully stood up from the plastic chair, taking the full weight of his granddaughter into his arms. She felt so incredibly small, a fragile structure compromised by the very person supposed to shelter her. He adjusted her head against his shoulder, her tiny hands falling limp against his thick canvas jacket. He turned toward the door, carrying his broken world out of the clinic. The countdown had begun, and Arthur Vance was going to tear a perfect life down to the studs. The tires of his old Ford truck hissed against the wet asphalt of the highway. Rain drummed a steady, relentless rhythm against the windshield, blurring the towering silhouettes of the Douglas firs lining the road. Arthur kept the heater on low, letting the mechanical hum fill the cab. He bypassed the exit that would take them back to the wealthy enclaves of Bellevue, turning away from the pristine glass and steel cage Eleanor called a home. He steered the heavy vehicle eastward, heading deeper into the foothills. Lily remained slumped in the passenger seat. She was secured firmly by the seatbelt, her head lolling slightly with the motion of the vehicle. She had not stirred a single muscle since he carried her out of the clinic. Looking at her small, pale face illuminated intermittently by the passing streetlights, Arthur felt the cold, hard resolve settling in his chest like poured concrete. His destination was his own cabin at the end of a long gravel driveway. It was a sanctuary he had built with his own 2 hands, framing the walls with solid timber and laying a foundation deep enough to withstand any seismic shift. It was a place where things were honest, where wood and stone did not lie. Arthur carried his granddaughter inside, laying her gently on the bed in the spare room. He pulled a thick woolen quilt over her frail shoulders, removed her small shoes, and left the doors slightly ajar. He walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of cold tap water, and picked up his cell phone. He needed to secure the perimeter before he could start tearing down the walls. He dialed Julian. The phone rang 3 times before the line connected. The chaotic background noise of a busy New York City street bled through the speaker, accompanied by the blare of a distant taxi horn. "Dad," Julian answered, his voice breathless and distracted. "Is everything okay?" Arthur controlled his breathing, smoothing out any tremor of emotion. His voice emerged as a flat, calm expanse. "Everything is perfectly fine, son. I picked Lily up from the house this afternoon for a late birthday treat. We went to get ice cream, but she seems completely worn out. I was hoping you would not mind if she stayed with me out at the cabin for a few days. Just some quiet grandfather and granddaughter time." A heavy sigh echoed through the phone, a sound of profound, misguided relief. "Honestly, Dad, that would be wonderful," Julian said. "Eleanor told me Lily has been acting out a lot lately. Throwing tantrums, refusing to eat, sleeping at the strangest hours. Eleanor thinks it is just a difficult phase, but it is really exhausting for her to manage alone while I am traveling. A few days out in the woods with you might be exactly what Lily needs to reset." Arthur gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The thick grain of the wood bit into his palm. Acting out. Exhausting to manage. It was the perfect, insidious cover story. Eleanor was slowly conditioning Julian to view his own daughter as a burden, a psychological problem that needed to be handled, all while she was the one actively administering the poison. "I will take very good care of her," Arthur promised quietly. "Thanks, Dad. You are a lifesaver. I have to run into a board meeting in 10 minutes. I will call you when my flight lands on Friday night." The line clicked dead. Arthur set the phone down on the table. The oppressive quiet of the cabin pressed in on him, amplifying the faint sound of Lily drawing shallow breaths in the next room. He closed his eyes, and the memory of the previous afternoon rushed back with sickening, crystalline clarity. He had arrived at the Bellevue mansion 3 days after Lily turned 7. His truck had suffered a blown alternator, delaying his visit. He remembered standing in the immaculate marble entryway, holding a wrapped box containing a set of premium-colored pencils. The house had felt sterile, devoid of the chaotic warmth that should accompany a child. Eleanor had glided down the floating wooden staircase, draped in expensive cashmere, her smile perfectly symmetrical and utterly devoid of genuine affection. "Arthur, what a surprise," she had said smoothly. In her manicured hand, she held a crystal tumbler filled with a thick, orange liquid. "Lily is up in her room. She is having one of her difficult days." Arthur had climbed the stairs to find his granddaughter sitting on the edge of her perfectly made bed, staring blankly at the wall. When she finally looked up at him, the sight had triggered an immediate alarm in his mind. Her eyes were glassy, her pupils sluggish to react to the afternoon light filtering through the window. Eleanor had followed him into the room, offering the tumbler to the little girl. "Drink your juice, sweetie. It has all your vitamins," Eleanor had coaxed. Her voice was light, musical, and terrifyingly patient. Lily had taken the glass with trembling, uncoordinated hands. She had looked at Arthur then, a deep, silent plea trapped behind a thick wall of pharmaceutical fog. She had leaned in, her breath smelling artificially sweet, and whispered that the juice made her head feel heavy. She said it tasted bitter, like the crushed medicine the doctor gave her when she had a fever. Eleanor had merely laughed a silvery, dismissive laugh, patting the child on the head and calling her an overly dramatic eater. Arthur opened his eyes in a dimly lit cabin kitchen. The memory was no longer just a collection of unsettling moments. It was the blueprint of a crime scene. The structural anomaly he had sensed the day before had just been exposed as a catastrophic failure. The foundation of his vague suspicion had solidified into a cruel, undeniable truth. The architect of this nightmare was currently sleeping comfortably in a pristine mansion, secure in the belief that she was untouchable, that her demolition of a little girl was going unnoticed. Arthur walked to the window and stared out into the dark, rainy woods. She had grossly miscalculated the load-bearing capacity of the man she was dealing with. The first 48 hours were a grueling test of structural integrity. The chemical fog began to lift from Lily, leaving behind a raw and exposed nervous system. It started on the second night. Arthur was sitting by the cast-iron wood stove when he heard the first muffled scream from the spare bedroom. He moved with quiet swiftness, pushing the door open to find his granddaughter tangled in the heavy woolen quilt. Her small body was trembling violently. Her eyes were wide open but unseeing, locked in a terrifying hallucination born from the sudden absence of the sedative. Arthur sat on the edge of the mattress. He did not pull her into a frantic embrace. Instead, he placed a steady, heavy hand on her shoulder, grounding her the way a solid anchor holds a ship against a storm. "You are safe, Lily," he murmured, keeping his voice at a low and consistent pitch. "You are in the cabin. The woods are quiet." Slowly, the panic subsided into exhaustion. She blinked, the glassy look replaced by a feverish clarity. Sweat dampened her dark hair, sticking it to her pale forehead. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice rough and dry. "My head hurts so much." "I know, sweetie," he said, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. "Your body is just cleaning itself out. It is flushing the bad things away." Lily clutched the edge of the blanket, her knuckles turning white. "Is Eleanor going to make me drink the medicine again? The special juice?" Arthur felt a muscle twitch in his jaw, a microscopic tremor of the immense rage he was suppressing. He kept his expression carved from stone. "No one is going to make you drink anything you do not want to drink. Not ever again. You have my word on that." Lily looked down at her pale hands, picking at a loose thread on the quilt. "The food she makes me when Daddy is gone is always bitter. Even the macaroni and cheese. And the juice is the worst. When I drink it, I get monsters in my head. The walls get stretchy and the colors go dark. I tried to tell Daddy once, but he said Eleanor works very hard on dinner and I need to be a good girl and finish my plate. He said I was just being picky." The absolute innocence in her voice was the most devastating part. She did not understand malice. She did not understand that the woman tasked with caring for her was systematically breaking her down. Lily only understood that she was supposed to be a good girl, even when being good meant swallowing poison to keep the peace in a wealthy household. Arthur poured her a glass of fresh water, ensuring she drank it slowly, before sitting with her until she finally drifted into a natural, albeit restless, sleep. Once her breathing evened out, Arthur walked back out to the kitchen table. He turned on the small overhead lamp, casting a tight circle of yellow light over the worn wooden surface. He reached into his thick canvas jacket and pulled out his engineering logbook. It was a heavy notebook filled with grid paper, usually reserved for calculating stress loads, material fatigue, and structural vulnerabilities in commercial buildings. He opened a fresh page. He did not write a diary entry. He did not record his heartbreak or the burning desire to drive his truck back to Bellevue and tear the front doors off that immaculate mansion. He recorded facts. He wrote down the date and the exact time. He documented her physical symptoms with absolute clinical detachment. Tremors, night sweats, elevated heart rate, visual disturbances and signs of chemical dependency withdrawal in a 7-year-old subject. Then, he wrote down the exact quotes Lily had given him. He treated her words as critical data points in a catastrophic failure analysis report. He noted that the subject reported food and liquids administered by the stepmother tasted bitter. He noted the onset of hallucinations immediately following ingestion. Most importantly, he documented the fact that the father had dismissed the child when she attempted to report the anomalies, choosing the comfort of his wife over the safety of his daughter. Arthur wrote with immaculate, sharp block letters in black ink. Every sentence was a brick being laid for a prison cell. Every bullet point was a nail in a coffin. He documented the withdrawal process with the cold precision of a lead investigator cataloging a disaster site. The anger was certainly there, buried deep in the marrow of his bones, but he channeled every single ounce of it into the tip of his pen. He knew that Eleanor was currently enjoying her quiet house, perhaps drinking an expensive glass of wine and admiring the pristine silence of her art gallery, completely unaware that a meticulously planned demolition was being drafted in a small cabin miles away. Arthur closed the logbook. The snap of the elastic band echoed loudly in the silent room. The cracks in the foundation were no longer hidden. They were measured, documented, and ready to be exploited. The morning of the third day brought a heavy mist over the pine trees. Lily was finally resting in a deep and natural sleep, her breathing steady and free of the chemical wheeze. Arthur arranged for a retired pediatric nurse who lived a mile down the road to sit quietly in the cabin parlor with a book. He promised he would be gone for exactly 60 minutes. He drove his truck to a solitary diner sitting on the edge of the county line, a place where loggers stopped and people did not ask questions. Elias Thorne was already sitting in the back booth, a mug of black coffee untouched in front of him. Elias was a private investigator who operated entirely in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest, a man who dug up buried secrets for the right price. Arthur slid into the vinyl seat across from him. He did not order anything. He placed a thick manila envelope on the table. It contained a substantial amount of cash and a single sheet of paper with the full legal name of Eleanor Vance, her social security number, and the addresses of her art gallery and the Bellevue mansion. Elias tapped the envelope. "I assume you want the usual," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Hotel receipts, photos of a lover, burner phone logs." "I do not care if she is entertaining half the city," Arthur replied, his tone devoid of any inflection. "Infidelity is a personal failure. I am dealing with a structural hazard. I need you to follow the money, Elias. Not the public gallery accounts. Look for hidden credit lines. Anonymous debit cards. I need her purchase history from online pharmacies that do not require a prescription. I need shipping manifests matching the exact dates my son was out of town on business." Elias raised an eyebrow, slowly pulling his hand back from the envelope. He looked at the cold, unyielding eyes of the older man. "Pharmacies. You are looking for a chemical trail." "I am looking for the blueprints of a demolition," Arthur corrected him quietly. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. When a building has a critical flaw, the architect will often try to patch it with cheap materials and cover it up with expensive paint. Eleanor is a load-bearing pillar in the life of my son, but she is completely rotten inside. If I just kick the pillar down, the roof caves in on my boy. I need to know exactly how she built her lies so I can dismantle her piece by piece. Arthur tapped his index finger against the wooden table, emphasizing his next point. I also need you to check the communication records of private psychiatric facilities out of state. High-end places. Institutions that specialize in difficult children. I believe she is planning to permanently relocate my granddaughter, and she is actively manufacturing the medical history to justify the commitment. Find the emails. Find the inquiry forms. Dig into every digital footprint she left behind while Julian was working. Elias slipped the envelope into the inner pocket of his coat. He did not ask any further questions. A professional recognized a man who was operating on absolute conviction and a very tight deadline. "When do you need the final report?" Elias asked. "My son flies back into Seattle on Friday night," Arthur said, standing up from the vinyl booth. "I need the entire schematic mapped out before his plane lands. I need every receipt, every timestamp, and every single lie documented on paper." Arthur walked out of the diner and stepped back into the freezing rain. He had initiated the next phase. The raw data of his granddaughter's suffering was secured in his logbook, and now, the forensic evidence of the malice Eleanor possessed was being hunted down. The trap was being meticulously set, waiting for the architect of this nightmare to step right into it. The air inside the Bellevue Art Gallery smelled of expensive espresso and pristine white paint. Eleanor Vance stood perfectly still in the center of the main exhibition room, holding her smartphone at a precise angle. The ambient lighting caught the sharp, delicate lines of her cheekbones and the soft drape of her tailored silk blouse. She adjusted her expression, letting her shoulders slump just a fraction to project a sense of elegant fatigue. She snapped the photo. She opened her social media application and began typing a caption with manicured thumbs. She wrote about the profound exhaustion of modern motherhood. She wrote about the unseen struggles of raising a child with severe, undiagnosed behavioral issues while her husband worked tirelessly across the country to provide for them. She added a subtle plea for strength and patience. She pressed publish. Within 3 minutes, the notifications began to cascade down her screen. Heart icons and sympathetic comments poured in from the wealthy wives of tech executives and local socialites. They called her a saint. They praised her endless devotion to a troubled stepdaughter. Eleanor locked her phone and smiled. The digital validation washed over her, cementing the flawless facade she presented to the world. To the public eye, she was a martyr trapped in a beautiful cage, doing her absolute best for a child who was slowly losing her grip on reality. She turned and walked gracefully past the massive, overpriced abstract canvases, retreating into her private office at the back of the gallery. She locked the heavy oak door behind her. The smile vanished from her face the moment the lock clicked. It was replaced by a look of cold, calculating efficiency. Eleanor did not hate Lily with a fiery, passionate rage. That would require viewing the child as a human being. To Eleanor, the 7-year-old girl was simply a structural defect in the perfect life she had curated. When Eleanor married Julian, she wanted the Bellevue mansion, the prestige, and the undivided attention of a wealthy, successful man. Lily was a chaotic variable. The child left toys on the immaculate rugs. She demanded her father's time, and her very existence was a constant, irritating reminder of Julian's past. Eleanor saw her life as a masterpiece canvas, and Lily was an ugly, dark smudge right in the center. A curator does not tolerate a smudge. A curator removes it. She sat down at her sleek glass desk and opened her laptop, bypassing the security screens to access a hidden, encrypted email account. The inbox contained a single thread of correspondence with the director of admissions at the Mountaintop Behavioral Institute, a highly exclusive and extremely remote residential psychiatric facility located in the deep wilderness of Utah. It was nearly 1,000 miles away from Seattle. Eleanor opened the latest attachment. It was the finalized involuntary commitment paperwork. The brochures promised rigorous psychological intervention for deeply disturbed, aggressive, and unmanageable adolescents. The facility was designed to isolate the patients completely, cutting off regular communication with the outside world to facilitate what they called an intensive reset. She scrolled through the medical prerequisites required for admission. The institution demanded a documented history of severe erratic behavior, chronic sleep disturbances, lethargy, and vocalized hallucinations. Eleanor read the list and felt a profound sense of pride. Over the past 6 months, she had single-handedly manufactured every single one of those symptoms. She thought of the tiny white pills, the heavy sedatives she had purchased through anonymous online pharmacies. She thought of the meticulous process of crushing them into a fine, bitter powder. It was almost an art form. She stirred the powder into the child's morning orange juice. She baked it into her meals. She administered the poison with the gentle, loving hands of a concerned mother. The results had been spectacular. Lily became sluggish, confused, and prone to terrifying night terrors as her small brain struggled to process the chemical assault. Whenever Julian called from his business trips, Eleanor would feed in carefully constructed reports of his daughter descending into madness. She manipulated his guilt over his constant absence, convincing him that the child was beyond their help. By the time Julian actually came home, Lily was always heavily medicated and catatonic, serving as the perfect physical proof to validate Eleanor's tragic narrative. Eleanor printed the thick stack of admission forms. The heavy paper slid from the printer with a satisfying, rhythmic hiss. All she needed now was the signature of the biological father. Once Julian signed the bottom line, a private medical transport team would arrive at the Bellevue house. They would take the child away, locking her behind the high walls of the Utah facility indefinitely. Julian would be heartbroken, but Eleanor would be right there to comfort him, to tell him they had done the right thing. The ugly smudge would be gone, and her masterpiece would finally be complete. She picked up her phone and drafted a text message to Julian. She kept her tone gentle, weary, and loving. She wrote that she was grateful Arthur had taken Lily for a few days, because her nerves were completely shattered from dealing with the tantrums. She told Julian that they needed to have a very serious conversation about the long-term future when he returned. She hit send. Eleanor neatly stacked the admission forms on her desk, aligning the edges perfectly. She felt no guilt. She only felt the quiet, immense satisfaction of a woman who had successfully rearranged reality to suit her exact preferences. The gravel driveway crunched heavily under the tires of an unfamiliar sedan just as the Thursday morning sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy of the Washington pines. Arthur Vance stood on the porch of his cabin holding a mug of black coffee. He watched Elias Thorne step out of the vehicle carrying a thick leather-bound ledger. It was precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. Arthur had 5 hours left on the clock Dr. Evans had given him. Elias walked up the wooden steps. He did not offer a greeting. He simply handed the ledger to Arthur. The weight of it was substantial. It felt like a solid brick of compressed truth. "You were right about the structural flaws," Elias said quietly, leaning against the wooden railing. She did not bother painting over the rot. She just assumed no one would ever bring a flashlight into the basement. Arthur carried the ledger inside and laid it flat on his large oak drafting table. He turned on the overhead halogen lamp. The bright, unforgiving light washed over the first page. Elias stood in the doorway, narrating the exact points of failure he had uncovered. "The chemical trail was remarkably easy to track once I knew where to look," Elias explained. She used a prepaid debit card register to a shell corporate entity linked to her art gallery. Over the past 7 months, she placed 8 separate orders for high-grade imported benzodiazepines through a Canadian online pharmacy that specializes in bypassing domestic prescription requirements. The shipments were routed to a private mail drop 2 towns over, never to the Bellevue house. Arthur turned the page. He saw the printed receipts. He saw the terrifyingly large quantities of the sedative. It was enough to tranquilize a grown man, let alone a 7-year-old child. "Page 12 is where she got sloppy," Elias continued. "She is meticulous inside her own house, but she views the outside world with arrogance. I pulled the security camera footage from a commercial dumpster behind a strip mall exactly 10 miles away from her neighborhood. Look at the timestamps." Arthur looked at the sequence of grainy, black and white photographs printed on heavy stock paper. They showed a sleek luxury SUV pulling up to the industrial bin late at night. A woman matching Eleanor perfectly stepped out. She wore dark clothing, but her posture was unmistakable. She tossed a Tide plastic bag into the trash. The final photograph in the sequence was taken by Elias himself. It showed the contents of that specific bag retrieved from the landfill sorting center. 4 empty, unmarked amber pill bottles. The heavy ceramic mortar she used to grind the poison into a fine powder. Arthur traced the edge of the photograph with his calloused thumb. His face remained carved from granite, but the air around him seemed to drop in temperature. "And the psychiatric facility?" Arthur asked, his voice a low rumble. "Mountaintop Behavioral Institute in Utah," Elias confirmed, pointing to the next tab in the ledger. "She submitted a formal application 3 weeks ago. The packet included a deeply falsified medical history. She logged every single lethargic episode, every hallucination, and every night terror Lily suffered. She documented the exact symptoms she was actively creating with the pills. She packaged it as a tragic case of early-onset childhood psychosis." Arthur stared at the printed emails between Eleanor and the admissions director. The casual, concerned tone Eleanor used made his stomach turn. She was negotiating the permanent exile of his granddaughter with the same detached professionalism she used to sell an abstract painting. The facility required the signature of the biological father to finalize the involuntary commitment. That was the final load-bearing wall she needed to knock down. Elias left the cabin shortly after, leaving Arthur alone with the blueprints of the crime. Arthur went to his coat pocket and pulled out his engineering logbook. He placed it next to the thick ledger. From a locked drawer in his desk, he retrieved a printed spreadsheet containing the travel schedule for Julian over the entire fiscal year. He spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing the data. The precision of the cruelty was staggering. Whenever Julian boarded a flight to New York or Chicago, an order for the sedatives was confirmed by the pharmacy. Whenever Julian was away for more than 3 days, the dosage clearly spiked, aligning perfectly with the dates Eleanor emailed the psychiatric facility to report severe behavioral regressions. She was manipulating the entire environment, turning the child into a compliant ghost just in time for Julian to return home exhausted, only to be met with a heavily medicated, unresponsive daughter and a deeply sympathetic, weary wife. The schematic was complete. The foundation of lies Eleanor had built was mapped out down to the very last millimeter. At precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Arthur picked up his phone and dialed the pediatric clinic. Dr. Evans answered on the first ring, his voice tight with anxiety. "Arthur, tell me you have something, or I am calling the authorities right now." "The perimeter is entirely secure, Doctor," Arthur said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who held the detonator in his hand. "I have the purchase records. I have the disposal footage. I have the falsified medical documents she prepared. I have every single lie mapped and verified. Do not make the call. If the police go to her house today, she will hire a team of lawyers and slip through the cracks of the legal system. What is your plan?" Evans asked, the authority draining from his voice, replaced by a quiet awe. "My son lands at Seattle-Tacoma Airport tomorrow evening," Arthur replied. "I am going to let him walk into his perfect house. And then, I am going to hand him the sledgehammer." Arthur hung up the phone. He looked at the mountain of evidence covering his drafting table. He neatly aligned the edges of the folders. The demolition charges were set. All that remained was waiting for the right man to press the button. The heavy rain of Friday evening pounded against the metal roof of the cabin, a relentless drumbeat that masked the sound of an approaching engine until the headlights swept across the front porch. Arthur Vance stood by the kitchen counter, watching through the rain-slicked window as his son stepped out of a silver luxury sedan. Julian pulled his expensive wool coat tight against the chill, holding a leather briefcase over his head as he jogged toward the wooden steps. Arthur turned back to the cast-iron skillet. A thick ribeye steak sizzled in a pool of dark butter and crushed rosemary. It was the exact meal Arthur had cooked for Julian after every major failure in his life. He cooked it when Julian failed his college entrance exams, and he cooked it when Julian lost his first startup company at the age of 29. Julian did not know it was a ritual of mourning. He just thought his father made good steak. The front door opened, bringing in a gust of frigid air and the smell of wet pine. Julian dropped his briefcase on the floor and let out a long, ragged exhale. He looked exactly like a man who had spent the last 5 days navigating corporate warfare, completely oblivious to the fact that his real home had been actively mined with explosives. "It is miserable out there," Julian said, hanging his wet coat on a wooden peg. He loosened his silk tie and rubbed his eyes. "Where is the birthday girl?" "She had a long day," Arthur replied, his voice a steady, calming baritone. "She is sleeping in the back room. I want to let her rest." "Good," Julian sighed, walking into the kitchen and leaning heavily against the counter. "Honestly, Dad, I could use some quiet tonight too. New York was a nightmare. The merger is pulling me in a dozen different directions." Arthur plated the steak, setting it on the rustic wooden dining table alongside a portion of roasted potatoes. He poured 2 glasses of red wine and took his seat. "Sit down, son. Eat before you collapse." Julian practically fell into the heavy oak chair. For the first 10 minutes, the only sounds in the cabin were the clinking of silverware and the crackle of the wood stove. Arthur chewed his food slowly, watching his son. Julian was a brilliant man in the boardroom, capable of seeing market trends years before they happened. But sitting across from him now, Arthur saw only a profound, tragic blindness. Julian was a man who trusted the foundation of his house so implicitly that he never bothered to check the basement for water damage. After finishing half his steak, Julian took a deep drink of wine and finally breached the subject Arthur was waiting for. "Eleanor called me 3 times today," Julian began, his voice taking on a defensive, exhausted edge. "She is at her absolute breaking point, Dad. She told me Lily had another massive episode before you picked her up." Screaming, staring blankly at the walls, refusing to eat anything Eleanor cooked for her. Arthur kept his face perfectly neutral. "Is that what she told you?" "Yes," Julian rubbed his temples, squeezing his eyes shut. "And it is not just this week. It has been getting progressively worse for months. I feel terrible leaving Eleanor alone to deal with it. She works so hard to keep the house peaceful, to be a good mother to a child that is not even hers, and Lily just punishes her for it. The sleepwalking, the lethargy, the sudden aggression. It is not normal." Arthur set his fork down. The metal clinked softly against the ceramic plate. "And what does Eleanor suggest you do about this abnormal behavior?" Julian looked down at his glass, swirling the dark red liquid. Shame radiated from his posture, but it was a shame built entirely on a foundation of lies. "She found a place. A residential program in Utah. Mountaintop Behavioral Institute. They specialize in severe childhood psychological disorders. It is an intensive, isolated environment." The name of the facility hung in the warm air of the cabin, toxic and heavy. Arthur felt the phantom weight of the engineering logbook resting in his coat pocket. He felt the crushing reality of the private investigator ledger sitting locked in his desk drawer. "A psychiatric institution," Arthur repeated, his tone devoid of any judgment, merely echoing the data back to his son. 1,000 miles away. "I know how it sounds," Julian said quickly, his voice rising in volume as he desperately tried to convince himself. "It sounds cruel. It sounds like I am giving up. But maybe Eleanor is right. Maybe we are completely unequipped to handle whatever chemical imbalance is happening in Lily. We have tried everything else. If she needs professional, full-time medical intervention, it is my job as her father to provide it, even if it breaks my heart." Arthur looked at his son. He saw the genuine pain in Julian's eyes. Julian truly believed his daughter was fundamentally broken. He truly believed his wife was an exhausted savior trying to salvage a deteriorating family. The sheer scale of the manipulation Eleanor had achieved was almost breathtaking in its cruelty. She had not just poisoned the child. She had poisoned the father's perception of his own flesh and blood. Arthur took a slow, measured breath. The surveying phase was officially over. The structural assessment was complete. The target was completely exposed. Julian had just handed his father the exact justification needed to commence the demolition. Arthur reached into his thick canvas jacket. The time for listening had passed. The silence in the cabin was about to be shattered permanently. Arthur withdrew his hand from the deep pocket of his canvas jacket. He did not pull out a weapon, but the objects he placed on the heavy oak dining table carried the exact same destructive force. First, he laid down the crisp white envelope containing the official toxicology report from Dr. Evans. Next, he set down his own worn engineering logbook. Finally, he reached into the drawer beside him and retrieved the thick leather-bound ledger provided by Elias Thorne. He placed it squarely in the center of the table, directly next to Julian's half-empty glass of red wine. Julian stopped rubbing his temples and stared at the objects. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his exhausted features, quickly followed by a shadow of annoyance. He let out a long sigh, the sound of a corporate executive being handed more paperwork at the end of a grueling week. "Dad, I am incredibly tired," Julian said, his voice tight with impatience. "I do not have the energy for whatever this is tonight. If this is about the estate taxes or the property deeds, it can wait until tomorrow morning." "It is not about the property," Arthur replied. His voice was an unnerving, absolute calm. It was the voice of a man standing at ground zero. "Open the white envelope, Julian. Read the paper inside." Julian frowned, his jaw tightening in defensive frustration. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against the rough wood, and pulled the envelope toward him. He broke the seal and unfolded the clinic letterhead. Arthur watched his son's eyes scan the top lines. He saw the exact moment Julian registered the name of the pediatric clinic. He saw Julian's brow furrow as he encountered the complex medical terminology. Then, Julian reached the highlighted section detailing the blood serum analysis. Benzodiazepine. Severe toxicity levels. Chronic and intentional administration. The annoyance vanished from Julian's face, replaced instantly by a pale, blank shock. His brain, conditioned to solve complex tech logistical problems, immediately attempted to reject the impossible data it was being fed. The defense mechanisms engaged. "This is completely absurd," Julian stammered, dropping the paper onto the table as if it burned his fingers. "The laboratory made a mistake. They mixed up her blood sample with an adult patient. Or maybe she got into the master bathroom. Eleanor takes a mild sleep aid sometimes. Lily must have found the bottle by accident. A 7-year-old child does not accidentally ingest a perfectly calibrated dose of heavy sedatives every single day for 6 months," Arthur stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "A child does not accidentally crush those pills into a fine powder and mix them into her own morning juice to hide the bitter taste." Arthur reached forward and opened the engineering logbook. He pointed to the neat, block letters written in black ink. "I kept her here, and I watched her go through chemical withdrawal," Arthur continued relentlessly. "She suffered night terrors. She shook. She told me the food Eleanor cooked for her was always bitter. She told me the juice gave her monsters in her head. She told me that she tried to warn you, Julian. She said you told her she was just being a picky eater." Julian recoiled as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The defensive walls were cracking, but he still clung desperately to the illusion of his perfect wife. "No. Eleanor loves her. Eleanor would never hurt her. You are twisting this, Dad. You have never liked Eleanor. Arthur did not raise his voice. He simply opened the heavy leather ledger to the first tap. He slid the Canadian pharmacy receipts across the table. Look at the billing name, Arthur commanded quietly. Look at the shell company registered to her art gallery. Now, look at the purchase dates. Arthur placed a printed copy of Julian's corporate travel itinerary next to the receipts. The visual correlation was devastatingly clear. Every time you boarded a flight to Chicago, New York, or Dallas, she placed an order for the drugs, Arthur explained, his finger tracing the parallel dates. Whenever you were gone for more than 3 days, the dosage spiked. She turned your daughter into a compliant, silent ghost so she would not have to deal with her. And when you came home, she presented you with a lethargic, damaged child, playing the role of the exhausted, dedicated stepmother. She manufactured the illness, Julian. She poisoned your daughter to convince you to lock her away in a Utah psychiatric ward. Julian stared at the dates. He saw the exact week he was in Manhattan negotiating a merger. It was the same week Eleanor had called in crying, claiming Lily had become entirely unresponsive. He looked at the next page of the ledger, showing the time-stamped photographs of Eleanor tossing the empty amber pill bottles into an industrial dumpster miles away from their wealthy neighborhood. The illusion shattered completely. The pristine image of his elegant, loving wife dissolved, revealing a cold, calculating predator who had been hunting his child in broad daylight. A horrific, suffocating silence filled the cabin, broken only by the sound of the rain violently lashing against the windows. Julian pushed his chair back. His hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He knocked over his wine glass, sending a dark red stain bleeding across the oak wood, but he did not even notice. He tried to draw a breath, but his chest heaved in a series of sharp, broken gasps. The realization crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. While he was sitting in corner offices building his wealth, while he was obsessing over his perfect corporate image, his little girl was being systematically tortured in her own home. He had ignored her complaints. He had handed her back to the monster every single time. Julian collapsed forward, burying his face in his hands. The polished tech executive disappeared, replaced by a completely broken father. A raw, agonizing sob tore from his throat, echoing terribly in the small kitchen. He wept with the profound, suffocating guilt of a man who realized he had been entirely blind. Arthur did not offer a gentle embrace. He did not whisper soft words of comfort. He stood up from his chair, walked around the table, and placed a heavy, unyielding hand on his son's shaking shoulder. His grip was like a vice, demanding strength. You cannot fix a shattered foundation by weeping over the broken concrete, Arthur said, his voice a low, commanding thunder. Tears will not save your daughter. Open your eyes, Julian. Stand up, clear the wreckage, and help me tear the rest of this rotten structure down. Julian dragged his hands down his face. The violent tremor in his fingers began to subside, replaced by a rigid, unnatural stiffness. He stared at the spilled red wine soaking into the grooves of the oak table, then looked up at his father. His eyes were bloodshot, but the naive exhaustion was gone, burned away by the devastating truth. I need to call the police, Julian said, his voice raw and grating. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards. I need to drive back to Bellevue right now and drag her out of that house. No, Arthur commanded. He did not shout, but the sheer weight of his voice stopped Julian in his tracks. Arthur walked to the sink, wet a clean cloth with cold water, and tossed it onto the table. Wipe your face and listen to me. If you call the authorities tonight, you trigger an uncontrolled collapse. You will give her exactly what she needs to survive. Julian picked up the damp cloth, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle ticked in his cheek. She poisoned my daughter. She belongs in a cell. And she will get one, but not if you strike blindly, Arthur explained, leaning over the heavy table. He tapped a calloused finger against the private investigator ledger. Eleanor is a wealthy, articulate, and highly connected woman. By Monday morning, she will have a team of elite defense attorneys sitting in your living room. They will look at this circumstantial evidence and they will spin a masterclass narrative. Arthur watched the tech executive mind of his son, the mind that ruthlessly dismantled rival corporations, slowly begin to engage with the problem. They will claim she suffered a severe mental breakdown, Arthur continued relentlessly. They will argue caregiver burnout. They will say she was desperately trying to calm a disturbed child and simply miscalculated a dosage. A sympathetic judge might give her a suspended sentence or a few months in a luxury minimum security facility. She will divorce you, take half your assets, and play the tragic victim in the local media for the rest of her life. That is not a demolition, Julian. That is just a remodeling. She will walk away. Julian gripped the edge of the table. The horrific reality of the legal system washed over him. His father was absolutely right. A cornered predator with unlimited financial resources was incredibly dangerous. Then how do we crush her? How do we make sure she never sees the outside of a concrete room? We let her dig the foundation for her own prison, Arthur said softly. The laboratory reports and the pharmacy receipts prove someone drugged Lily. The Dunster photographs prove Eleanor disposed of the empty bottles. But a ruthless defense attorney could still argue that you bought the pills and framed her to win a custody battle. We need irrefutable, high-definition proof of her actively preparing the poison. Arthur stepped back, folding his arms across his chest. He laid out the schematic of their revenge. Julian was to return to the Bellevue mansion the following morning. He had to suppress every single ounce of his hatred. He had to act exactly like the exhausted, defeated husband Eleanor expected him to be. He would walk through the front doors, drop his bags, and tell her that the business trip had drained the last of his resistance. You will tell her she is right, Arthur instructed, his eyes locking onto his son. Tell her you are ready to sign the commitment papers for the Mountaintop Behavioral Institute. Give her the absolute victory she has been engineering for the past 6 months. Julian felt violently sick at the thought of looking into his wife's eyes and conceding his daughter to a psychiatric ward, but the cold, flawless logic of his father anchored him to the floor. Once she believes she has won, she will lower her guard completely, Arthur continued. She will want to prepare Lily for the transport. She will need to heavily sedate her one last time so the child is compliant and lethargic when the medical extraction team arrives. You will install a microscopic, wide-angle lens camera in the kitchen. You will capture her grinding those pills and mixing them into the juice with her own hands. Julian nodded slowly. The tears had completely dried, leaving behind a terrifying, hollow calm. He looked down at the engineering logbook, tracing his daughter's name with his thumb. I have the equipment, Julian said quietly. Small security cameras we use for testing smart home prototypes at the firm. They are no larger than a button. I can hide one in the decorative trim above the kitchen island and sync it directly to a secure cloud server on my phone. She will never see it. Good, Arthur said. He picked up the empty wine glass and set it in the sink. You sleep here tonight. You gather your strength. Tomorrow, you go back to the house. You do not yell. You do not accuse. You smile, you agree, and you wire the building to explode. Julian stood up straight. His posture was entirely different from the broken man who had collapsed an hour prior. He had arrived at the cabin as a blind victim, stumbling through a house constructed entirely of lies. He was leaving as the lead engineer of a meticulously planned demolition. The heavy oak door of the Bellevue mansion swung open on Saturday morning. Julian stepped into the pristine foyer, dropping his leather travel bag onto the polished marble floor with a heavy, defeated thud. He let his shoulders slump. He let the exhaustion of the past 5 days wash over his features, masking the terrifying, cold clarity his father had instilled in him the night before. Eleanor emerged from the living room. She wore a soft cashmere sweater, her expression perfectly tuned to project a mixture of gentle sympathy and deep sorrow. She approached him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. Julian stood perfectly still. It took every ounce of his willpower, every fragment of his corporate discipline, not to wrap his hands around her throat. Instead, he returned the embrace, resting his chin on the top of her head. He told her she was right. He let the words fall from his mouth like heavy stones. He said he was utterly exhausted, that he had spent the entire night agonizing over the decision at his father's cabin, and that he could no longer deny the reality of the situation. He told Eleanor that Lily needed professional help, the kind of help they could not provide in a normal home environment. Eleanor pulled back slightly, looking up into his eyes. She placed a comforting hand on his cheek. She whispered that he was being a good father, that making the hardest choices was the ultimate act of love. She played her role flawlessly. Julian asked to see the admission paperwork for the Mountaintop Behavioral Institute. Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining with unshed, fabricated tears. She told him the documents were in her upstairs office and turned to retrieve them. The moment her foot touched the first step of the floating staircase, Julian moved. He did not hesitate. He walked silently into the massive, open-concept kitchen. From his coat pocket, he extracted a microscopic smart camera, a prototype no larger than a shirt button. He reached up to the decorative wooden trim position directly above the marble kitchen island, pressing the adhesive backing firmly against the dark wood. The lens was entirely invisible, blending perfectly into the shadows of the molding. He pulled out his smartphone, opened the secure application, and verified the live feed. The wide-angle lens captured the entire kitchen counter, the sink, and the refrigerator in brilliant, 4,000-pixel resolution. Julian slipped the phone back into his pocket just as Eleanor returned to the ground floor holding a thick manila folder. They sat at the glass dining table. Julian took the expensive fountain pen she offered him. He did not read the falsified medical history. He already knew every lie printed on those pages. He simply flipped to the final page and signed his name on the dotted line, officially authorizing the involuntary psychiatric commitment of his only daughter. Eleanor let out a soft, trembling exhale. The absolute victory was secured. The load-bearing wall had been removed, and the obstacle was finally cleared from her perfect life. She gathered the papers, her movements smooth and relaxed. The tension that usually gripped her shoulders vanished entirely. The predator had caught its prey, and it was time to feast on the silence. Julian stood up, checking his watch. He announced that he would drive out to the cabin, pick Lily up, and bring her straight back to the house to wait for the medical transport team they had scheduled for Sunday morning. Eleanor offered a warm, maternal smile. She told him she would prepare a fresh pitcher of juice and some soft food to keep Lily calm during the transition. She said the child always felt better after a familiar drink. Julian thanked her, walked out the front door, and got into his silver sedan. He did not start the engine. He locked the doors, rolled up the windows, and pulled his phone from his pocket. He opened the secure video application and stared at the screen. Inside the house, Eleanor walked into the kitchen. She was completely alone. Julian watched the live feed on his phone. He saw the exact moment the sympathetic, loving wife ceased to exist. Her posture straightened. The soft, sorrowful expression melted away, replaced by a look of cold, efficient boredom. She walked to the pantry and retrieved a heavy ceramic mortar and pestle. She placed it on the marble island, directly beneath the hidden lens. Then, she reached into the deep pocket of her cashmere sweater and pulled out a small amber pill bottle. The label was completely blank. Julian watched, his breath catching in his throat, as his wife unscrewed the cap. She tapped 5 small, white pills into the ceramic bowl. 5 heavy doses of a central nervous system depressant. She picked up the pestle and began to grind them. The microphone on the hidden camera was sensitive enough to pick up the harsh, rhythmic scraping of the ceramic crushing the chemicals into a fine powder. She retrieved a carton of premium orange juice from the refrigerator and poured it into a glass pitcher. With steady, practiced hands, she swept the bitter white powder into the orange liquid. She took a long wooden spoon and stirred the mixture until the poison was completely dissolved, leaving absolutely no trace of the violence she had just committed. Julian tapped the screen of his phone, officially saving the video file to 2 separate, secure cloud servers. He watched Eleanor put the mortar and pestle into the dishwasher and place the poison pitcher into the refrigerator. The trap was not just set. It had been triggered. The final, irrefutable piece of evidence was locked away behind military-grade encryption. Julian started the engine of his car. He was not driving to the cabin to collect a broken child. He was driving to the cabin to gather an army. The Sunday morning sun filtered beautifully through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Bellevue mansion. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the pristine air, illuminating the expensive abstract art hanging on the walls. Eleanor Vance stood in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting the collar of her muted gray blouse. She had chosen the outfit carefully. It was somber, respectful, and perfectly suited for a mother about to hand her severely disturbed stepdaughter over to a psychiatric medical transport team. She practiced a look of profound, exhausted sorrow. She let one perfectly manicured hand rest against her collarbone. It was a flawless performance. In the kitchen, the glass pitcher of premium orange juice sat chilling in the refrigerator, laced with enough heavy sedatives to ensure Lily would be completely docile and unresponsive when the orderlies arrived. The trap was waiting. All Eleanor needed was for her husband to walk through the door with the child. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the absolute silence of the house. Eleanor took a deep breath, summoned her fabricated tears, and walked gracefully to the front entryway. She opened the heavy oak door, her face arranged in a mask of tragic sympathy. The mask slipped immediately. Julian stood on the porch, but his hands were empty. He was not holding Lily. He was not looking at his wife with exhausted gratitude. His eyes were completely dead, dark and flat like frozen lakes. Before Eleanor could process the empty space next to him, the shadows on the porch shifted. Arthur Vance stepped forward. The older man looked like a monument carved from granite, his broad shoulders blocking the morning light. And then came the others. 2 uniformed police officers stepped up onto the stone porch, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. Behind them stood a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit holding a thick leather briefcase. Eleanor felt the air vanish from her lungs. The pristine foundation of her life gave a terrifying, silent shudder. "Julian," Eleanor said, her voice faltering, the musical lilt entirely gone. She instinctively took a step back into the foyer. "What is going on? Where is Lily? Why are the police here?" Julian did not say a word. He stepped past her, his shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He walked directly into the open-concept kitchen and stopped at the massive marble island. Arthur followed him inside, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of an inspector surveying a condemned building. The 2 officers and the lawyer entered last, closing the heavy front door behind them. "Julian, you are frightening me," Eleanor tried again, desperately attempting to pivot back to the role of the fragile victim. She looked at the police officers. "Officers, please, I do not understand what is happening. My husband is under an incredible amount of stress regarding his sick daughter." "Your acting is no longer required," Julian said. The absolute lack of emotion in his voice was far more terrifying than any shout could ever be. He reached into his coat pocket, retrieved his smartphone, and placed it flat on the pristine marble counter. He tapped the screen once. The volume was turned all the way up. The high-definition recording began to play. The sound of the heavy ceramic pestle grinding against the bowl echoed loudly through the silent kitchen. Eleanor froze completely. She stared at the small screen, watching her own hands meticulously crush the white pills. She watched herself pour the bitter powder into the orange juice. The undeniable, high-resolution proof of her malice played out for everyone in the room to see. Julian picked up the phone and locked the screen. He looked at the woman he had once loved, the woman he had trusted with his most precious asset. The clinic found the toxins in her blood on Tuesday. My father found the online pharmacy receipts from Canada on Thursday. He found the security footage of you dumping the bottles in the commercial trash bin. And yesterday, I watched you prepare the poison with my own eyes. The tall man in the charcoal suit stepped forward. He unlatched his leather briefcase and placed a thick stack of legal documents onto the counter next to the spot where Eleanor had ground the pills. I am Mr. Sterling, representing Julian Vance. You are being served with immediate divorce proceedings, a permanent restraining order regarding Lily Vance, and an emergency asset freeze on all joint accounts connected to your art gallery. Eleanor opened her mouth, but her vocal cords refused to work. The flawless curator, the elegant socialite, the master manipulator was completely paralyzed. The load-bearing walls of her lies had been detonated simultaneously. The structure was coming down. One of the police officers stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Eleanor Vance, you are under arrest for aggravated child endangerment and the intentional administration of a noxious substance. You have the right to remain silent. The cold click of the steel cuffs locking around her slender wrists finally broke the paralysis. The sophisticated facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Eleanor did not weep delicately. She did not beg for forgiveness. She exploded. She began to thrash violently against the officers, her muted gray blouse tearing at the shoulder. She screamed, a raw, ugly sound that stripped away every ounce of her curated elegance. She cursed Julian, calling him a weak, pathetic fool. She turned her venomous eyes toward Arthur, spitting insults at the old man who had orchestrated her downfall. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, revealing the ugly, rotting core she had kept hidden for so long. The police officers forced her toward the door, her expensive shoes dragging across the polished marble. She kicked at the doorframe, screaming about her reputation, her gallery, and her ruined life. Arthur stood perfectly still, his hands resting in the pockets of his canvas jacket. He watched the officers drag the thrashing, shrieking woman out of the beautiful house. He felt no pity. He only felt the profound, cold satisfaction of a successful demolition. The explosive charges had been placed perfectly. The blast was completely controlled. The threat was entirely neutralized. He turned to look at his son, knowing the hardest part was over, and the rebuilding could finally begin. The legal system moved with a slow but crushing weight. Faced with the high-definition video, the Canadian pharmacy receipts, and the medical toxicology reports, the expensive defense attorneys hired by Eleanor Vance completely crumbled. She accepted a plea deal to avoid a highly publicized trial, resulting in a sentence of 10 years in a state penitentiary. Her pristine art gallery went bankrupt within 3 months. Her carefully curated social media presence became a digital graveyard of public disgust. The illusion of her perfect life was reduced to absolute ash. Julian Vance was granted full and absolute custody of his daughter. He sold the massive Bellevue mansion, leaving the cold marble and the horrific memories far behind. He stepped down from his grueling executive travel schedule, choosing a lower position that allowed him to stay home. He finally realized that no amount of corporate wealth could ever replace the time he had been blind to his own family. 6 months later, the Pacific Northwest sun broke through the thick clouds, casting a warm golden light across the wooden porch of the rural cabin. Arthur Vance sat in his heavy rocking chair, holding a warm mug of black coffee. He looked out at the front yard. Julian was sitting on the grass, holding a large sketchbook. Beside him sat Lily. Her dark eyes were clear, bright, and completely free of the chemical fog that had once trapped her. She was laughing, a sound as pure and true as a ringing bell, as she proudly showed her father a colorful drawing of a bluebird. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee. He had spent his entire life studying stress fractures, load-bearing walls, and failing foundations. He knew that some structures had to be completely demolished so something much stronger could take their place. Looking at his son and his granddaughter, the old engineer smiled softly. The foundation of his family had been tested by a terrible storm, but it had been successfully rebuilt. This time, it was absolutely unbreakable. The story of Arthur, Julian, and Lily teaches us a profound lesson about the true meaning of protection and the severe dangers of blind trust. It reminds us that true malice does not always hide in dark alleys. Sometimes, it wears a perfect smile, dresses in elegant clothes, and lives right inside our own homes. Real love requires constant presence, unwavering attention, and the ultimate courage to see the painful truth even when a comfortable lie is much easier to accept. A strong family is built on a foundation of absolute truth and shared presence, not just financial convenience. How did this story make you feel today? Have you ever experienced a moment in your real life where you had to face an incredibly difficult truth to protect someone you truly love? We want to hear your thoughts and feel the emotions from the bottom of your hearts, so please leave your personal feelings and experiences in the comments down below. If this story touched your heart and kept you listening until the very end, please hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share it with your friends and family to listen to many attractive videos every single day. We sincerely wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.